Marcus Chen woke up that Tuesday morning with a sense of purpose that had defined his entire adult life. For 12 years, he had served as a royal protection officer in the elite security detail of the British royal family. His uniform, pressed to perfection, hung on the door of his London flat. The medals on his chest told stories of dedication, of standing in the rain for hours, of late nights protecting dignitaries at state functions, and of one particularly harrowing incident where he had placed himself between danger and a member of the royal household. At 42 years old, Marcus had seen the world through a unique lens. He had traveled to 60 countries, always 2 steps behind or ahead of the royals he protected. His face had become familiar to security personnel at major airports across the globe. Immigration officers knew him by name. His credentials were impeccable, his record spotless. He was the kind of man who followed protocols to the letter, who believed in the system, and who took pride in representing his country with honor and dignity. That morning, as he prepared for his flight to New York, Marcus had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He was traveling on personal leave, a rare 2-week vacation to visit his sister Sarah, who had moved to America 5 years earlier. She had been asking him to visit for months, and finally, he had managed to secure the time off. His luggage was packed with casual clothes, gifts for his niece and nephew, and a few books he had been meaning to read. Marcus drove to Heathrow Airport in his modest sedan, arriving 3 hours before his flight, as was his habit. He never liked to rush. The morning traffic was light, and he found parking easily in the long-term lot. As he pulled his suitcase from the trunk, he caught his reflection in the car window. Even in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt, he stood with the posture of a military man. Old habits were hard to break. The terminal was busy with the usual Tuesday morning crowd. Business travelers rushed past with laptop bags and coffee cups. Families with young children struggled with oversized luggage. Marcus moved through the chaos with practiced ease, his eyes automatically scanning for security personnel and exit routes. It was second nature to him now, this constant awareness of his surroundings. He checked in at the counter without incident. The airline representative smiled at him, processed his passport, and wished him a pleasant flight. Marcus made his way through the initial security checkpoint, placing his bag on the conveyor belt and walking through the metal detector. Nothing unusual. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. What Marcus did not know was that earlier that morning, intelligence agencies across Europe had received a vague security alert. The details were sketchy, something about a potential threat involving individuals with military or security backgrounds who might be traveling under legitimate credentials. The alert was one of hundreds that came through daily, most of them false alarms or based on outdated information. But in the current climate of heightened security awareness, no alert was ignored entirely. At Security Station 7 in Terminal 5, Officer David Pemberton was beginning his shift. He was relatively new to the job, having transferred from a smaller regional airport just 6 months earlier. David was eager to prove himself, perhaps too eager. He had been praised the previous week for his attention to detail when he had identified a passenger carrying prohibited items. His supervisor had told him he was showing promise, and David wanted to maintain that reputation. When Marcus approached the secondary screening area, a random selection that happened to every 5th or 6th passenger, David was the one assigned to conduct the additional check. He looked at Marcus's passport, noted the unusual number of stamps and visas, and then his eyes fell on Marcus's occupation listed on the customs form, Royal Protection Officer. Something clicked in David's mind. The morning briefing had mentioned individuals with security backgrounds. He looked at Marcus again, this time with suspicion rather than routine professional courtesy. Marcus, waiting patiently with his hands at his sides, noticed the change in the officer's demeanor. He had seen it before, this shift from neutral to cautious. Usually it resolved itself quickly once his credentials were verified. David asked Marcus to step aside. It was phrased as a request, but both men knew it was not optional. Marcus complied without hesitation, maintaining his calm, professional demeanor. He had nothing to hide. His documentation was in order. This would be cleared up in a few minutes and he would be on his way to his gate. But David had already made up his mind that this warranted further investigation. He called for his supervisor, who arrived and looked over the situation. The supervisor, a woman named Janet Foster with 20 years of experience, assessed Marcus with a more practiced eye. She saw a man standing calmly, showing no signs of nervousness or deception. But she also knew that in the current environment, they could not afford to take chances. The vague morning alert was still fresh in her mind. Marcus was asked more questions. Where was he traveling? For what purpose? How long had he been a protection officer? Could he provide additional identification? Marcus answered each question, clearly and thoroughly, pulling out his official credentials, his letter of leave from his commanding officer, even his sister's address in New York, and her phone number for verification. But something had shifted. What should have been a routine verification was beginning to take on the characteristics of an interrogation. More security personnel were arriving. Marcus noticed passengers in the nearby lines starting to watch. His calm exterior remained intact, but inside, he felt the first stirrings of concern. Not fear exactly, but an awareness that this situation was escalating in a way that made no logical sense. The supervisor made a decision. They would need to conduct a more thorough screening in a private area. It was procedure, she explained, when there were questions that needed to be answered. Marcus knew his rights, knew that he could demand to speak with someone from his own agency, but he also knew that cooperation would resolve this faster than resistance. He agreed to accompany them to a secondary screening room, still believing that this was simply a bureaucratic mix-up that would be sorted out shortly. As he was led away from the public screening area, his phone in a plastic bin behind him, his luggage being taken in a different direction, Marcus Chen had no idea that cameras were already recording, that social media posts were already being composed, and that in less than an hour, his face would be known to millions of people around the world. The morning that had started with such promise was about to become the longest day of his life. The private screening room was small and windowless, with white walls that seemed to absorb sound. A single metal table sat in the center with 3 chairs around it. Marcus was asked to sit while 2 security officers stood by the door. The supervisor, Janet Foster, sat across from him with a tablet in her hands, reviewing his information. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a persistent buzz that Marcus found oddly irritating. Marcus maintained his composure, answering the same questions he had already answered at the checkpoint. His voice was steady, his explanations clear. Yes, he was a Royal Protection Officer. Yes, he had traveled extensively for his work. No, he was not currently on duty. This was personal travel to visit family. He offered to have his commanding officer contacted for verification. He provided additional documentation from his wallet, including his security clearance identification. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the airport that morning. Word had spread among security personnel about a possible situation with a detained individual claiming to be a royal guard. In the heightened security environment that governed modern air travel, caution had evolved into something closer to paranoia. What should have been a simple verification call to Marcus's agency had become entangled in bureaucratic procedures and chain-of-command protocols. Outside the screening room, in the public terminal, a young woman named Emma Rodriguez had witnessed the initial detention. She was a travel blogger with a substantial social media following, always looking for interesting stories. When she saw a well-dressed man being led away by multiple security officers, her instincts told her this was noteworthy. She had managed to capture a few seconds of video on her phone before security asked her to move along. Emma posted the video to her social media accounts with a simple caption, "Man being detained at Heathrow. Looks intense. Anyone know what's happening?" Within minutes, the video had been shared dozens of times. Other passengers who had been in the area began commenting, adding their own observations. Someone mentioned hearing the detained man was supposedly a royal guard. Another person claimed they heard he had been acting suspiciously. The story was beginning to take shape, fed by speculation and the hunger for breaking news. Back in the screening room, Marcus checked his watch. 45 minutes had passed since he had been brought in. His flight was boarding in 30 minutes. He mentioned this to Janet Foster, who assured him they were working as quickly as possible. She stepped out of the room to make another call, leaving Marcus with the two officers who continued to stand silently by the door. Marcus used the time to mentally review his situation. He had done nothing wrong. His credentials were genuine. His travel was legitimate. This was clearly a misunderstanding that would be resolved. He thought about calling his sister, but his phone had been taken with his other belongings for security screening. He considered asking to contact a lawyer but decided that might make him appear defensive or guilty of something. He had faith in the system, in the protocols he had spent his career upholding. What Marcus did not know was that his situation had already exploded beyond the confines of that small room. Emma's video had been picked up by a news aggregator account with millions of followers. News outlets were beginning to notice. The headline was being crafted in newsrooms across the city. Royal Guard detained at Heathrow Airport. The story was spreading faster than any official response could hope to contain it. In the airport's main terminal, more people were becoming aware of the situation. Passengers waiting for their flight scrolled through their phones and saw the video. Some recognized the terminal and realized they were in the same building where this was happening. The mood began to shift. People started gathering near the security area, trying to see what was going on. Airport security noticed the growing crowd and called for additional personnel. Janet Foster returned to the room looking more stressed than before. The verification process was taking longer than expected. Marcus's commanding officer was in a meeting and could not be reached immediately. The letter of leave Marcus had provided was being authenticated, but the person who needed to verify it was not in the office. Standard procedures that usually took minutes were stretching into an hour, because everyone involved was being extra cautious. Marcus felt his frustration building but kept it contained. He explained again that he would miss his flight if this continued much longer. Janet sympathized but said she had to follow protocol. She could not release him until proper verification was complete. It was not personal, she insisted. It was just procedure. Marcus understood procedure, but he also understood that something had gone wrong with how it was being applied. Outside, Emma Rodriguez had been joined by other passengers who had their own phones out, recording and posting. A man named James Chen, no relation to Marcus, had recorded his own video showing the growing security presence around the screening area. He posted it with the comment, "Something big going down at Heathrow. Security everywhere. They're keeping people back from the screening area." The story was mutating as it spread. Some social media users claimed Marcus had been carrying suspicious items. Others said he had been argumentative with security. None of these claims were based on facts, but once posted, they took on a life of their own. People who had not been there and had not seen anything were sharing opinions as if they were eyewitness accounts. A journalist named Patricia Walsh, who specialized in security and civil liberties issues, saw the posts and began making calls. She contacted her sources in airport security and law enforcement. What she learned troubled her. A man with verified credentials and a spotless record was being held based on what seemed to be nothing more than excessive caution and bureaucratic delay. She began drafting a statement for her online news site. Marcus, still sitting in the screening room, was unaware that his face was now appearing on screens across London and beyond. He did not know that hashtags were forming around his detention. He did not know that civil rights groups were already being contacted by concerned citizens. He was simply waiting, with growing impatience, for someone to make a phone call and clear this up. When Janet Foster returned again, she had her supervisor with her, a senior manager named Robert Harrison. Robert looked at Marcus with a mixture of apology and determination. He explained that they were doing everything they could to expedite the verification process, but it was taking time. Marcus asked how much more time. Robert could not give him an answer. He said they needed to be absolutely certain before they could release him. Marcus pointed out that his credentials were valid and could be verified with a simple phone call. Robert agreed but said the phone call was taking longer than expected. The reality was that the morning security alert, vague as it was, had created a bureaucratic paralysis. No one wanted to be the person who released someone and then later discovered they had made a mistake. Everyone was covering themselves, passing decisions up the chain requiring additional confirmations. What should have been a 5-minute verification had become a full-scale security review. Marcus missed his flight. The boarding time came and went. He asked what would happen now. Robert said they would work with the airline to get him on the next available flight, but first the verification had to be completed. Marcus felt the last of his patience beginning to fray. He had been cooperative, had answered every question, had provided every document requested. How much more could they possibly need? Outside, the crowd in the terminal had grown larger. Airport police were now managing what was becoming a scene. Passengers were posting live updates. News crews were being dispatched to the airport. The story that had started with a few seconds of video was now developing into a full-blown incident. And at the center of it all, unaware of the storm gathering around him, Marcus Chen sat in a windowless room and wondered when someone, anyone, would simply make the phone call that would end this nightmare. 2 hours into his detention, Marcus Chen finally understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Through the door of the screening room, he could hear raised voices, the sound of many people talking at once and the crackle of police radios. Robert Harrison had left and returned 3 times, each time looking more harried than before. The last time he had not been alone. He brought with him a representative from airport administration and someone who identified himself as being from the Metropolitan Police Liaison Office. The police representative, Detective Sergeant Michael Wright, sat down across from Marcus and spoke in a calm, measured tone. He explained that the situation had become complicated. Marcus's credentials had been verified by his commanding officer 20 minutes earlier. Everything checked out. He was exactly who he said he was, with the background and clearances he claimed to have. There was no reason to detain him further from a security standpoint. However, they now had a different problem entirely. Michael pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a video. It was shaky footage of Marcus being led from the public screening area to the private room. The video had been viewed over 2 million times. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. Michael swiped to another video, then another. Each showed different angles of the incident, with commentary ranging from concerned to outraged. The hashtag #ReleaseTheGuard was trending. News websites had published articles. People were demanding answers. Marcus felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. While he had been sitting in this room answering the same questions repeatedly, the outside world had transformed his routine security delay into an international incident. He asked to see more. Michael obliged, showing him social media posts, news headlines, opinion pieces being published in real time. Some defended the security measures, saying safety had to come first. Others condemned what they called racial profiling and security theater. Marcus noticed that speculation about his ethnicity was part of the narrative. His Chinese heritage was being discussed, debated, and used to support various arguments about bias in security procedures. Outside the secure area, the terminal had become chaotic. What had started as a small crowd of curious onlookers had grown into hundreds of people. Some were passengers whose travel plans had been disrupted by the commotion. Others were protesters who had seen the story online and traveled to the airport specifically to demonstrate. They held signs demanding fair treatment and an end to security overreach. Airport officials were struggling to maintain normal operations while managing what was rapidly becoming a public relations disaster. Emma Rodriguez, whose initial video had sparked the firestorm, was now being interviewed by television news crews. She described what she had witnessed, careful to stick to the facts but aware that her role in the story had made her a minor celebrity. Other passengers who had been present were also being interviewed. Each person's account differed slightly, shaped by where they had been standing and what they thought they had seen. The collective narrative being constructed bore only partial resemblance to what had actually occurred. Patricia Walsh, the journalist who had been following the story from the beginning, published a detailed article on her news site. She had managed to get statements from civil liberties organizations, security experts, and anonymous sources within the airport. Her piece was balanced but critical, questioning whether Marcus's detention had been handled appropriately and whether similar incidents were happening to others without the benefit of viral video documentation. The article was shared thousands of times within the first hour of publication. Back in the screening room, Marcus was trying to process the situation. Detective Sergeant Wright explained that they wanted to release him immediately, but the crowd outside had made that complicated. They were concerned about his safety and about managing the public response. Marcus asked what any of this had to do with him. He had been cooperative from the start. He had done nothing wrong. Why was his release contingent on crowd management? Wright sympathized but explained the reality. If they simply let Marcus walk out now, he would be mobbed by journalists and protesters. His face was already known to millions. His privacy was gone. They needed to have a plan for how to handle this. Marcus felt anger rising in him for the first time that day. His vacation had been ruined. His sister was probably worried sick. He had been unable to contact her. His reputation was being discussed by strangers across the internet. And now he was being told he could not leave because leaving had become too complicated. Airport administration was in crisis mode. The director of operations, Helen Matthews, was fielding calls from government officials, airline executives, and media outlets. She had to make decisions quickly about how to handle the situation. The airport's reputation was at stake. There were calls for an investigation, for policy changes, for someone to be held accountable. Helen knew that how they managed the next few hours would determine the long-term fallout. A press conference was hastily organized. Helen would make a statement, acknowledging the situation and explaining that the detained individual had been fully cleared and would be released shortly. She would emphasize that security procedures had been followed, that there was no evidence of wrongdoing by security personnel, and that the delay had been due to necessary verification processes. She would not mention Marcus by name, respecting his privacy, though everyone already knew who he was. The press conference was broadcast live on news channels and streamed online. Helen read her prepared statement, her voice steady despite the pressure. Journalists shouted questions. Had there been racial profiling? Why had verification taken so long? What compensation would be offered? Would anyone be disciplined? Helen deflected most questions, promising a full review of procedures while defending her staff's actions. The statement did little to calm the situation. On social media, people were not satisfied with bureaucratic explanations. They wanted accountability. Some called for boycotts of the airport. Others demanded policy reforms. Civil rights organizations issued statements supporting Marcus and calling for investigations into security practices. Political figures began weighing in, each putting their own spin on the incident according to their ideological positions. Marcus, watching a television in the screening room where the press conference was being shown, felt a surreal detachment from the whole situation. That was him they were talking about, but it felt like they were discussing a stranger. The person being described in news reports and social media posts did not match his experience. He was not a victim or a symbol or a hashtag. He was just a man who had tried to catch a flight to visit his sister. Robert Harrison returned with a proposal. They would escort Marcus out through a private exit, away from the crowds and cameras. A car would take him wherever he needed to go. The airline had agreed to put him on a flight the following day, first class, with full compensation for the inconvenience. They would also provide a hotel room for the night. It was the least they could do, Robert said, though they maintained they had acted appropriately given the circumstances. Marcus considered refusing, considered walking out the front entrance and confronting the media circus. But he was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the first hours of detention was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. He agreed to the private exit. He just wanted this day to end. As he was led through corridors away from public view, Marcus passed windows overlooking the main terminal. He could see the crowd below, the signs, the cameras, the chaos that his simple attempt to board a flight had somehow created. He thought about all the times he had stood guard himself, maintaining security, following protocols. He had believed in the system. He still wanted to believe in it, but something had broken today, something that could not be easily repaired with press conferences and compensation packages. The car that would take him away was waiting at a service entrance. Marcus climbed in, finally alone for the first time in hours. As the vehicle pulled away from the airport, he pulled out his phone, which had finally been returned to him. It was flooded with messages, calls, notifications. His sister had tried to reach him dozens of times. Friends and colleagues had sent concerned texts. News organizations were requesting interviews. His commanding officer had left a voicemail asking him to call as soon as possible. Marcus turned off the phone and watched London pass by the window. Somewhere in this city, people were still arguing about what had happened to him, what it meant, what should be done about it. But Marcus was no longer thinking about any of that. He was thinking about his sister's face when he finally arrived. about the vacation that had already been cut short before it began, and about how strange it was that a morning that started with such ordinary hopes could end with him at the center of a storm he never asked for and did not know how to navigate. The hotel room the airport had provided was upscale and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos Marcus had left behind. He sat on the edge of the bed, his phone turned off and placed on the nightstand, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The digital clock read 8 in the evening. He had been awake for 15 hours, and most of that time had been spent in various states of detention, questioning, and confusion. He should have been in New York by now, hugging his sister, meeting his niece and nephew, beginning a vacation he had planned for months. Instead, he was in a London hotel room, his face plastered across news websites, his life turned inside out by circumstances he still did not fully understand. He had finally called his sister from the car, explaining as best he could what had happened. She had cried with relief, having spent hours imagining worst-case scenarios when he did not arrive and could not be reached. She told him not to worry about the vacation, that the important thing was he was safe, that he should take care of himself. But Marcus could hear the disappointment in her voice, the plan she had made now in ruins. Across London, in a conference room at the airport administration building, an emergency meeting was underway. Helen Matthews sat at the head of the table, surrounded by security directors, legal advisors, and public relations consultants. They were trying to piece together exactly what had gone wrong and how to manage the fallout. The timeline was being reconstructed minute by minute. Security footage was being reviewed. Every decision point was being analyzed. Janet Foster was there, looking drained and defensive. She explained her reasoning at each stage of Marcus's detention. The morning security alert had been real, even if vague. Marcus's travel history and occupation had matched the profile mentioned in the alert. She had followed procedure by escalating to her supervisor. The delays in verification had not been her fault. The commanding officer had been unreachable. The authentication system had been slow. She had done everything by the book. David Pemberton, the officer who had first flagged Marcus for additional screening, was also present. He was younger than the others, less experienced and clearly shaken by how the situation had developed. He had thought he was doing his job, being vigilant, catching something others might have missed. Now he was being portrayed in some media coverage as either overzealous or prejudiced, depending on the source. He insisted he had not profiled Marcus based on race or ethnicity. The occupation and travel history had been the triggers, nothing else. Robert Harrison presented the security footage from the checkpoint. It showed Marcus approaching, being directed to secondary screening, complying with every request, showing no signs of resistance or suspicious behavior. It also showed David's body language changing when he looked at Marcus's documents, the way he had called for his supervisor with an urgency that seemed, in retrospect, disproportionate to the situation. The legal advisor, a sharp woman named Caroline Hughes, was taking notes throughout the discussion. She explained the potential liabilities the airport faced. There could be lawsuits alleging false imprisonment, defamation, and discrimination. Even if Marcus himself did not sue, others might use this incident as a precedent in their own cases. The airport's insurance would cover some damages, but the reputational cost could be enormous. The public relations consultant, Marcus Wong, no relation to Marcus Chen despite sharing a first name, presented his analysis of the social media response. The story had spread across multiple platforms, generating millions of interactions. Public opinion was divided but leaning towards sympathy for Marcus Chen. There were calls for policy changes, for better training, for accountability. Some were calling this an isolated incident blown out of proportion, while others saw it as evidence of systemic problems in security procedures. Helen Matthews listened to all of this with growing frustration. She wanted to know what they should have done differently. At what point could someone have made a different decision that would have prevented this escalation? Janet Foster argued there was no such point. Given the morning alert, given Marcus's profile, given the need for thorough verification, everything that happened was justifiable. Caroline Hughes disagreed. She pointed out that Marcus had been detained for over 2 hours after his credentials were verified. That time was unnecessary and indefensible. Meanwhile, in her small apartment in East London, Patricia Walsh was conducting her own investigation. She had obtained copies of the morning security alert that had partially triggered Marcus's detention. Reading through it carefully, she was struck by how generic and nonspecific it was. It could have applied to thousands of people traveling through UK airports that day. She wondered how many others had been subjected to additional scrutiny based on this alert. People whose detentions had not gone viral because no one had been there to record. Then Patricia began reaching out to civil liberties, organizations and security experts for their perspectives. Dr. Amira Hassan, a professor who specialized in security policy, agreed to speak with her. Dr. Hassan explained that the problem was not that security personnel were following procedures, but that the procedures themselves were flawed. They were designed to cast wide nets based on vague criteria, inevitably catching innocent people. The system prioritized caution over efficiency, which meant innocent people paid the price for that caution. Another expert, former Airport Security Director Thomas Blackwell, offered a different view. He argued that in the post-attack security environment, erring on the side of caution was not just reasonable but necessary. The public wanted to feel safe, and that required vigilance. Yes, sometimes innocent people were inconvenienced, but that was preferable to letting a genuine threat slip through. He acknowledged that Marcus's case had been mishandled in terms of communication and timing, but the underlying decision to conduct additional screening was sound. Emma Rodriguez, the travel blogger whose video had started the viral spread, was experiencing her own complicated feelings about the situation. Her follower count had tripled overnight. Media outlets were requesting interviews. She was being praised for her citizen journalism and criticized for invasion of privacy in equal measure. She had not intended to create such a massive story. She had simply recorded something that seemed newsworthy and shared it. Now she was part of the narrative, her name linked to Marcus Chen's in ways she had not anticipated. She decided to publish a follow-up post, explaining her perspective. She wrote about witnessing the initial detention, about her instinct to document what she saw, and about her shock at how quickly the story spread. She expressed empathy for Marcus and hoped he was doing okay. She also defended her decision to post the video, arguing that transparency and security procedures benefited everyone. The post generated thousands of comments, both supportive and critical. Back at the hotel, Marcus finally turned his phone back on. The flood of notifications was overwhelming. He scrolled through them, seeing messages from people he had not spoken to in years. Interview requests from major news organizations, statements of support from colleagues, and a surprising number of messages from complete strangers offering encouragement. His commanding officer had sent a detailed message explaining that the agency supported him fully and would assist with any legal actions he chose to pursue. There was also a message from David Pemberton, the security officer who had initially flagged him. Marcus almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of him. The message was brief and clearly difficult for David to write. He apologized for the situation, explained that he had been following training and protocol, and said he never intended for things to escalate the way they had. He acknowledged that Marcus had been nothing but cooperative, and that the extended detention had been unfair. He hoped Marcus could understand he had been trying to do his job properly. Marcus read the message twice. He felt anger, certainly. His vacation was ruined, his privacy violated, his reputation subjected to public debate by millions of strangers. But looking at David's apology, he also felt something else, a recognition that David was probably not much different from him, someone trying to do a difficult job in a complex system that did not always function as it should. The anger was easier than that recognition, but Marcus was too tired for anger. He thought about responding, but decided to wait. He needed more time to process everything. Instead, he called his sister again. They talked for over an hour, not about the incident, but about her life in New York, her children, the neighborhood she lived in, all the normal things they would have discussed if he had arrived as planned. It felt grounding, a reminder that beyond the media storm and the investigations and the public debates, there was still a life waiting for him, relationships that mattered more than hashtags and headlines. As their conversation wound down, Sarah asked him what he was going to do next. Marcus realized he did not have an answer. The airport had offered him a flight the next day, but he was not sure he wanted to take it. Part of him wanted to go home to London, to familiar surroundings, to rebuild some sense of normalcy. Another part of him wanted to complete his journey, to not let this incident steal the vacation he had earned. He told Sarah he would decide in the morning. After hanging up, Marcus stood at the window of his. The morning after his detention brought no respite for Marcus Chen. He woke to discover that his story had crossed international borders overnight. News outlets in America, Europe, and Asia were running their own versions of the incident, each filtered through local perspectives on security, civil liberties, and discrimination. His face appeared on breakfast television shows across multiple continents. The hashtag that had started as Release the Guard had evolved into broader movements demanding security reform and civil rights protections. Marcus sat in the hotel restaurant, wearing sunglasses indoors in a futile attempt at anonymity, scrolling through news coverage on his tablet. A major American news network had done a segment comparing his case to similar incidents in the United States. A European civil rights organization had issued a statement using his detention as evidence of overreach in security procedures across the continent. An Asian news outlet had focused on the racial dynamics, interviewing experts on bias in Western security systems. His private nightmare had become a global talking point. At the Houses of Parliament, Member of Parliament Victoria Stern was preparing to raise the issue during Prime Minister's questions. She had built her career on civil liberties advocacy, and Marcus's case was perfect for her purposes. She had her staff compile a dossier of similar incidents that had not received media attention, cases where travelers had been detained for hours based on vague criteria and bureaucratic delays. She planned to demand answers about security protocols and call for an independent review of airport procedures. Her political opponents were preparing their own responses. MP Richard Thompson, known for his hardline stance on security, was drafting a statement defending the airport's actions. He would argue that security personnel had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, that the alternative to vigilance was vulnerability, and that public safety had to take priority over individual convenience. He saw Marcus's case not as an injustice, but as the necessary price of living in a world where threats were real and consequences severe. The debate was already forming along predictable lines, with each side using Marcus's experience to reinforce positions they had held long before he walked into Heathrow Airport. Progressives saw systemic discrimination and security theater. Conservatives saw necessary precautions and Monday morning quarterbacking of difficult decisions. Marcus, watching political figures discuss his life on television, felt a growing sense of unreality. They were not talking about him, not really. They were talking about symbols and abstractions, using his face as a vehicle for their agendas. At Heathrow Airport, the staff meeting that morning was tense. Helen Matthews addressed security personnel directly, aware that morale was suffering. Some officers felt unfairly vilified for doing their jobs. Others felt embarrassed by the incident and worried about being associated with it. The union representing security workers had issued a statement supporting their members, while also calling for better training and clearer protocols. They wanted protection for workers who made good faith decisions, even when those decisions led to uncomfortable outcomes. Janet Foster had not slept well. She kept replaying the detention in her mind, wondering what she could have done differently. She had followed every step of her training. She had escalated when appropriate. She had tried to expedite verification, yet somehow she was now part of a story about security failure and possible discrimination. Her name had not been released publicly, and she was grateful for that small mercy, but her colleagues knew her role. Some were supportive, others distant, as if her involvement might be contagious. David Pemberton had considered calling in sick, but decided he needed to face the situation directly. He arrived at the airport early before most of his colleagues, and went through his morning briefing with mechanical precision. He was aware of people looking at him, whispering when they thought he could not hear. His supervisor had assured him he had done nothing wrong procedurally, but the qualifier procedurally hung in the air like an accusation. He had done nothing wrong according to the rules, but the rules had produced an outcome that was clearly wrong in some larger sense. At her desk in the newsroom, Patricia Walsh was working on a longer investigative piece. She had obtained statistics on security detentions at major UK airports over the past year. The numbers were striking. Thousands of travelers had been subjected to extended questioning and searches, the vast majority of whom were eventually cleared without incident. The data showed patterns that suggested certain demographics were disproportionately affected. Though airport authorities disputed this interpretation, arguing that demographics correlated with travel patterns and risk factors. She interviewed former detainees who had not had the benefit of viral videos to draw attention to their cases. A businessman from Pakistan who had missed an important meeting after being questioned for 3 hours. A student from Egypt who nearly lost her scholarship when she was prevented from traveling to start her university term. A family from Morocco whose vacation was ruined by a detention based on mistaken identity. Each story was different in details but similar in the essential experience of being caught in a system that seemed designed to presume guilt until innocence could be laboriously proven. Dr. Amira Hassan, the security policy professor Patricia had interviewed, was using Marcus's case in her university lectures. She walked her students through the decision tree that had led to his detention, asking them to identify the points where different choices could have been made. Her students were divided. Some thought security officers had been right to err on the side of caution. Others thought the system was fundamentally broken if it could trap innocent people so easily. The debates in her classroom mirrored the debates happening across society. Marcus's commanding officer, Colonel James Whitmore, was dealing with fallout within the Royal Protection Service. Marcus was a respected member of the team, and his detention had angered many of his colleagues. There were discussions about whether the service should issue a stronger public statement, whether they should provide legal support for any actions Marcus chose to take, and whether this incident exposed vulnerabilities in how their officers were treated when traveling. The royal household itself was aware of the situation and monitoring developments carefully. Concerned about how this reflected on the institution, Sarah Chen, Marcus's sister in New York, had become an unexpected spokesperson by virtue of her relationship. American media outlets had found her and requested interviews. She had declined most but agreed to speak with one trusted journalist, hoping to humanize her brother beyond the symbol he had become. She talked about Marcus as a child, always responsible, always following rules, always trying to do the right thing. She talked about his dedication to his job, the pride he took in serving, the way he believed in systems and institutions. She worried about how this experience would change him. The interview with Sarah aired on a major American news program and was widely shared. It added a personal dimension to a story that had become abstract through political debate and social media arguments. Viewers saw Marcus not as a political talking point but as someone's brother, someone who had simply wanted to visit family. The response was overwhelmingly sympathetic, which generated its own backlash from those who felt the security officers were being unfairly demonized. Back in London, Marcus made his decision about the flight. He would go to New York. Not because the airport had offered compensation, not because it would make a statement, but because his sister and her children were waiting, and he refused to let this incident steal something precious from him. He informed the airport of his decision, and they arranged for a discreet early morning departure, trying to avoid media attention. The airline had upgraded him to first class and assigned him a personal escort through security. This time, the process was smooth and respectful, almost obsequiously so. Security officers who checked his documents treated him with exaggerated courtesy. Marcus appreciated their professionalism, but felt uncomfortable with the special treatment. He did not want to be handled like fragile glass or like someone dangerous who required kid glove treatment. He wanted to be treated like what he was, a passenger catching a flight, nothing more or less. As he sat in the airport lounge waiting for his flight, Marcus watched the news coverage on the television screens. A panel discussion was debating his case, with experts and pundits offering their analyses. A security expert defended the airport's actions. A civil rights lawyer condemned them. A political commentator tried to find middle ground. None of them really understood what it had felt like to sit in that room for hours, to feel your identity reduced to a file that needed verification, to watch your plans dissolve into bureaucratic procedures. His phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Whitmore. The Royal Protection Service had decided to commission an independent review of how their officers were treated when traveling on personal business. They wanted to ensure this did not happen to anyone else. The message also conveyed personal support from senior members of the royal household. Marcus appreciated the gesture, but knew that reviews and policies would not change the fundamental tensions in a security system built on suspicio. Sarah Chen was waiting at John F. Kennedy Airport when Marcus finally arrived. She spotted him as he emerged from customs looking tired but determined. She ran to him, her children following behind, and wrapped him in a tight embrace. Marcus hugged her back, feeling the tension of the past 2 days begin to loosen its grip. His niece and nephew, 10 and 8 years old, looked at him with wide eyes, having seen their uncle on television and not quite understanding what it all meant. Marcus knelt down to their level and smiled, telling them he was just happy to be there. The days that followed were precious to Marcus in ways he had not anticipated. Sarah's home in Queens was ordinary and wonderful, a place where the controversies and debates meant nothing. He played board games with the children, helped Sarah cook dinner, and spent evenings talking about family history and shared memories. The outside world continued its arguments about his detention, but inside this small house, he was just Uncle Marcus visiting from England, telling stories about his work and listening to the children talk about their school and friends. But the outside world did not completely disappear. Interview requests continued to pour in. Legal advisors reached out offering to represent him if he wanted to sue the airport. Civil rights organizations asked him to speak at events and lend his voice to their causes. Political figures wanted to use his story as evidence for their policy positions. Marcus declined almost everything, needing space to process what had happened before deciding what, if anything, he wanted to say publicly. One request he did accept came from a small non-profit organization that worked with young people from immigrant families who were interested in careers in public service. They asked if he would speak to a group of high school students about his experiences as a Royal Protection Officer and his journey through the security system. Marcus agreed, thinking it might help him make sense of the incident to talk about it with people who had no agenda beyond understanding. The event was held in a community center in Brooklyn. About 30 students attended, their faces reflecting the diversity of New York itself. Marcus talked about his career, the training and dedication required, the pride he took in his work. Then he talked about the airport detention, not dwelling on the political aspects but focusing on his experience of being caught between systems, of having his identity reduced to paperwork, of the frustration of knowing he had done nothing wrong but being unable to prove it quickly enough to satisfy bureaucratic requirements. The students asked thoughtful questions. One young woman asked if the experience had made him angry at security officers. Marcus thought carefully before answering. He said he had been angry, still was angry at times, but he had also learned that anger directed at individuals missed the larger point. The security officers were working within a system that set them up for exactly this kind of failure. The problem was not any single person but the structures and protocols that prioritized certain types of security theater over reasonable procedures. A young man asked if Marcus still believed in public service after being treated so poorly by the system he had served. Marcus admitted the question kept him awake at night. His faith in institutions had been shaken but not destroyed. He still believed that public service mattered, that security was necessary, that people needed to work within systems to make them better, but he also believed that systems needed to be accountable, that procedures needed to be questioned, and that the cost of security should not always be paid by innocent people who happened to fit suspicious profiles. After the talk, several students came up to thank him. One young man, whose family had immigrated from Syria, told Marcus his own story of being detained at an airport with his family for hours when he was 12 years old. He said seeing Marcus's story on the news had made him feel less alone, had validated his experience in a way nothing else had. Marcus felt the weight of that, the recognition that his private ordeal had become meaningful to others who had suffered similar experiences in silence. Back in London, the investigations and reviews were producing their findings. The airport commissioned an independent report on the detention. The report found that while security officers had followed existing protocols, the protocols themselves were inadequate. Verification procedures needed to be streamlined. Communication between different departments needed improvement. Training should include better guidance on when to escalate versus when to de-escalate situations. The report stopped short of saying anyone had done anything wrong, but it clearly indicated that things needed to change. Helen Matthews implemented several of the recommendations immediately. New procedures were established for verifying credentials of security personnel and government officials. A direct line was set up to relevant agencies to expedite confirmation. Training programs were updated to emphasize proportionality and time management. The airport issued a formal apology to Marcus, accompanied by a financial settlement that compensated him for his disrupted travel and the invasion of his privacy. Janet Foster and David Pemberton kept their jobs but were reassigned to different roles. Janet moved into training, using her experience to help develop better protocols for handling similar situations. David took a position in airport administration, stepping away from frontline security work. Both of them carried the incident with them, a reminder of how quickly routine procedures could spiral into crises when multiple factors aligned badly. Victoria Stern, the MP who had championed Marcus's case in Parliament, succeeded in getting a broader review of security procedures at all major UK airports. The review took months and involved testimony from security experts, civil rights advocates, travelers who had been detained, and airport officials. Its final recommendations called for better oversight, clearer guidelines, and regular audits of detention practices. Some recommendations were implemented, others were watered down during the legislative process, and a few were ignored entirely. It was the nature of institutional change, incremental and imperfect. Patricia Walsh's investigative series on airport detentions won a journalism award and led to similar investigations in other countries. The stories she had uncovered, including Marcus's, created pressure for reforms across Europe. Some changes happened quickly, others took years, and many problems remained unresolved. But the conversation had shifted. The presumption that security procedures were beyond question had been challenged, and that mattered. 3 months after the incident, Marcus returned to London and to his job. His first day back was awkward, with colleagues treating him like he might break or like he had somehow changed into a different person. But gradually things normalized. He resumed his duties protecting members of the royal family. He stood his posts, traveled on official business, and maintained the professional standards he had always upheld. The work was the same, but his perspective had changed. He noticed things he had not noticed before, moments when security measures seemed disproportionate to actual risk, times when procedures created more problems than they solved. He started speaking up more in internal meetings, offering suggestions for improvements based on his experience. Some of his ideas were welcomed, others dismissed, but he kept speaking anyway. He joined a working group within the Royal Protection Service that was examining operational procedures and making recommendations for updates. It was slow work, pushing against institutional inertia, but Marcus found it meaningful in ways his regular duties sometimes were not. Sarah visited London 6 months later, bringing her children to see where their uncle worked and lived. Marcus took them to tourist sites, showed them the city he loved, and introduced them to colleagues who had become friends. His niece asked if he ever thought about the airport incident anymore. Marcus said yes often, but it did not make him as angry as it used to. It had taught him things about systems and people and himself that he needed to learn, even though he would not have chosen that particular method of learning. Emma Rodriguez stopped by London on one of her travel blogging trips and reached out to Marcus through social media. She asked if they could meet for coffee. Marcus was hesitant but agreed. They met at a cafe near Victoria Station, the conversation initially stiff and formal. Emma apologized for posting the video, even though she still believed documentation served an important purpose. Marcus said he understood her reasoning, even if he wished his worst day had not become public entertainment. They talked for over an hour, finding common ground in their shared belief that something good should come from difficult experiences. Before they parted, Emma asked Marcus what he wanted people to remember about what happened. Marcus thought about the question, about all the debates and arguments and think pieces that had used his face and name. He said he wanted people to remember that behind every security incident, there were human beings making decisions with limited information under pressure. He wanted people to remember that systems created by humans could be changed by humans, and he wanted people to remember that security and dignity were not opposites, that it was possible to keep people safe while treating them with respect. A year after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from David Pemberton, the security officer who had first flagged him at the airport.